the and I'm going to pin myself so then it doesn't flip between the two perspectives. So, Jeremy, thanks for joining. I think people have already had a flavour of the kind of beauty and richness of what you're sharing through your perspective on the planetary civilization. But before we go to that element, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit to people? They get to know your background so that they can understand where your work's coming from.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and be part of the Phenomenal Conversation series. Yeah, for those who don't know my work or aren't familiar, I am, I guess, a scholar of consciousness studies. I am a PhD student at the moment in the philosophy program at California Institute of Integral Studies. And I am also a writer and an author. And so what I do with all of that is I really try to think and sense through our shifting relationship with the more than human world. And particularly, I'm very interested with my background in the philosopher John Gebser. You might surmise that I'm very interested in the history of consciousness, the history of particularly human consciousness evolving through these various transformations or mutations, a reworking of self and world and the perception of self and world, and moving between identities and realities that constitute this long history of consciousness. And right now, my work is very much interested in bringing forward some of what Gebser was attempting to articulate in the mid 20th century. He was one of these grand thinkers with a big picture view of the history of consciousness. But particularly, he had very interesting things to say about how a new consciousness, a new relationship with time and space was coming about and evidenced in the 20th century. And it had to do with what he called sort of integrative view. And I've heard echoes of that from things that I've already heard us sharing here in our group today. A view that really acknowledges differentiation and individuality and distinctiveness, but also recognizes this deeper, more underlying or pervading unity or integration, a sort of primordial integrality that we all participate in. So, Gebser himself was a bit of a mystic, contemplative intellectual of sorts, and a poet. And I find myself in a sort of similar position, not to call myself a mystic, but to be drawn towards, in a poetic sense, the contemplative and the senseful, attempting to articulate this transforming relationship and worldview we're going through right now, with all of the tools in my toolkit, right? As a writer, as a scholar, as somebody who's attempting to kind of find my own way through these realities as civilizations kind of breaking open and unraveling. And I think I would be somebody who would affirm that through that dissolution, as Gebser would say, there's also a solution. There's something that is emerging in us and through us in this process. And I suppose I would say that I've committed myself or dedicated myself to attempting to articulate what that might mean. What are we becoming? What might we become that isn't a kind of conclusion to the human story or to the story of Gaia, but something that can open up new possibilities, a new relationship. That would be my stab at it.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Jeremy. And you've mentioned Gebser. I know that he is quite a phenomenal figure. And obviously, you present a program each year on his work, but there's endless depth to it. You've mentioned the evolution of consciousness and what Gebser saw. Could you sort of encapsulate some of what he's bringing that is inspired you to almost dedicate your life to studying him and bringing out? I know that's a lot there, so but we don't have time to go into it. But can you encapsulate some important features to people that maybe haven't heard of him before?
Sure. Yeah, I think fortunately it's easier to kind of point to the impact that Gebser had on me than necessarily explain his whole
Yeah.
version of history. But that I think in that there's something that is transmissible into why or what his philosophy is about. And particularly, I think for me, reading Gebser, it was a very interesting experience where I felt that he was able to communicate effectively in language, in words, uh, almost a felt sense of what it may have been like to be, let's say, 2000 years ago, right? He has these categories or schema removed through these different structures of consciousness, and really for each one he really kind of brings them to life on the page, right? There's a vividness to his descriptions and illustrations, because I think he, being a poet and a bit of an artist himself, he was really attempting to give to write down, to give language to something that is far more difficult, far more imperceptible, right? What is a sense of self? And let's say our relationship with time in the ancient world, when time was more cyclical and rhythmic, right? He really brings the past to life. And that was sort of me coming into contact with him for the first time and why I found him so compelling. And then he also, flipping that as well, not just the history of consciousness, but also a sense of what may be arising in us today. What are these transformations looking like today, and who are the poets, the painters, the artists, the philosophers who share a similar attitude? So he really gives you a felt sense of that new attitude in yourself, if that makes sense. And then he also brings the past to life in such a vivid way that it just very compellingly kind of brings you into this vast history, right? Brings it to life, lets it live in you. And I think a good writer is able to do that. They're able to kind of bring the content of their work into a sort of vivid aliveness, right? Where you're drawn into the work and you live the work with the author. I think Gebser is one of those kinds of writers. He could be profoundly challenging too and dense. Don't get me wrong, but there's also these beautiful transformative moments that I think are possible.
I wondered if we could just take a little bit more into his work, because you mentioned mutations, and then you mentioned the primitive or ancient self, or the human as an ancient, more primeval self. Could you talk about the key mutations and how Gebser was able to perceive these mutations? What was the means whereby he could point out, or how did he point out what these mutations were, just so that we get a little bit more detail on that side of things?
Sure. Yeah. So Gebser's, the language he gives to these mutations, he calls them mutations rather than I don't know, stages, or he describes them as these discontinuous leaps, right? A reworking, a retransformation, a restructuration of consciousness. And he has just a handful that many other scholars have sort of adapted into their own work, including Ken Wilber. And they are the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the mental, and the integral. And they kind of unfold, yes, in a sequence, but on the other hand, they're really interestingly discontinuous and almost rhizomatic, and that they have these interrelationships. And at each moment of history, if we're looking at their gradual unfoldment, a movement from the archaic to the magic being the archaic being a kind of root, a sort of latency of all the future unfoldments, of all the future mutations, a kind of uh, primordial sleeping wholeness, right? It sort of escapes history. It's the event horizon of history. You can't really say there's a particular date where we were archaic. But nevertheless, I think, magic is a bit more vivid, and it comes more historically to life in animist worldviews, a relationship with timelessness, a continuity between the human and the more than human, as we see this sort of permeable version of the self, right? That's able to sort of extend into and participate in the world, and is profoundly auditory. Gebser uses this note that to belong, or to hear in German, Horn and Gehören have this interconnection etymologically. So to hear is to belong to the world, right? To participate in the world. So that's the magic, a little taste of the magic. But the mythic introduces a kind of soulful temporicity, right? It's in a distinction between the earth and the sky, right? An opening up of a kind of cosmology where there's great cosmic cycles, right? Time is introduced, and time has these magnificent different qualities depending on when we're looking at our calendar, right? Time is very much qualitative and intensive rather than quantitative and extensive as we get in. Well, we can move to the mental, right? We have more of this separate self sense in the ego. We have the capacity to abstract ourselves and imagine ourselves as standing apart from the world. And many things can come out of that, including what we get with Western empiricism and the great kind of axiological movements of civilizations, right? The sort of axiological turn, or the axial age, as it's called, the sort of transcendental orientation or transcendence orientation of the great ancient civilizations. And as we sort of move through this history, you kind of notice that each of those, the archaic, magic, mythic, mental, they all sound like integral components of what it means to be a full, whole human being.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we can see history sort of emphasizing the magic, and then we move gradually towards the mythic, and then gradually towards the mental. So there is a kind of movement to history, but then also it's speaking to a kind of innate integrality and interrelationship. These different structures kind of all show up and rearrange themselves as history unfolds very dynamically. And they go through periods of, let's say, creative expression and fulfillment. And they also go through periods of sort of stagnation and stasis and deficient, moving from efficient to deficient, right? So Gebser is really contextualizing our moment is very much in the sort of the end of the mental structures little epoch where it's been exclusively emphasized, and the need to kind of move into what he says an integral structure, integral mutation, where we're actually able to move in and out of our dynamic wholeness, so the unity of all of the structures. And it has to do with a kind of complex time, right? Where time is no longer clock time and the self is no longer separate. The achievements of distinction and individuality aren't undone, but they're folded in to this sort of processual and relational unity, right? Where we're still an individual, but we're an individual that is in flow with the cosmos and participates in let's say, nature's creativity. And there's a lot more to say about it, but that's sort of the little
Well,
mini
I think,
capsule-sized version of
well, I'm
what.
going to indulge myself and hopefully the audience, because I love that the subtlety and nuance of the way that you're using words. I think that's also a faculty of how we describe the world. Like you echoed back to Gebser's inspiration of how he described the world and made it alive for you of the different mutational phases. But this new phase, or this new turn, uh, seems to require, in at least in the beginning, some facility with language and speaking to it. So I'd love to hear more about the phase and the turn you're seeing, and this integral phase and its potential going towards an ecological, a planetary civilization. So how does this turn, or where do you see this leading in terms of the planet, as it were?
Mm. Yeah, wonderful question. And that, as you know, could be an entire course, right? Like
Yeah.
what is the integral mutation? What are its characteristics? And thankfully, if we give time to Gebser's main central book, his sort of opus, The Ever-Present Origin, the whole second half of the book is dedicated to exploring that question, attempting to answer it, attempting to give it a intellectual and philosophical and spiritual due, like what it's due in terms of how do we really articulate the emerging integral world. On the one hand, I would say, after many years of reflection on this question, integrality, or he also calls it aperspectivity. That was a sort of older phrase he used for it, which then became a kind of catch-all for, well, this is the world we're moving into, right? The aperspectival world. And he means by that, he's using not to make it ahistorical, but to denote a kind of freedom, a kind of openness that's at the heart of it, a freedom from any one form of consciousness, any archaic, magic, mythic, but a freedom for every one of the mutations, right? So there's this spaciousness that's I think one of the profound and fundamental qualities to the integral mutation. It's a returning to, as Gebser says, the archaic as a kind of originary consciousness, but it's doing so consciously. It's reinvigorating the archaic consciously as a conscious agent, right? That has been individuated and now participates both as an individual in their waking mind with a sense of self-separateness, but then also capable of holding that continuity, that unity at the same time. And a lot of different thinkers and writers talk about this, in the grand scheme, like Sri Aurobindo has a wonderful way of describing this as the supramental, and he also uses integral in his own way. But folks like William Irwin Thompson describe it as complex dynamical consciousness, or planetary biospheric consciousness, things like that. So what it has to do with, as you're pointing to, like what's the connection with the planet, is it's really this turn away from exclusively viewing the world as something that we can divide up and exclusively know rationally. We participate in our unity and our wholeness, but we won't ever exhaustively map it out. Another contemporary writer, Bruno Latour, who recently passed away, has a great way of writing about this move from the global to the planetary. And this move is really about, he uses the image of the globe as a map of latitude and longitude that sort of divides up the world, right? It gives us the false pretense that we can stand apart from the whole and know the whole thing and spin it around, right? It's been spatialized. Now, for Latour and many other contemporary thinkers, and I think Gebser would love to see this as an illustration of the integral, we can never know the world in that way. There's always a dark side to the world, like there's a dark side to the moon. We need an epistemic humility, right, which is characteristic of the integral structure. We participate in a thing, in a reality that we don't exhaustively, consciously, or abstractly know. So there is a humility that I think is another characteristic quality here. And then finally, maybe the last point where we can kind of open up into more inquiries is there's a temporal dimension to the integral, right? We have this spaciousness, we have this sort of plenitude and freedom and openness, but there's also a move to reintroduce not quantitative time, but qualitative time. And Gebser was sort of interesting in that he sort of anticipated, cybernetics theory and systems and complexity theory, writing about this in the 1940s, where he was saying, we need to learn how to think with time, that time must inform our intellect and not the other way around, where we arrest the world and divide it up. Our concepts have to be wriggling and alive and dynamic as the world is alive and dynamic. And part of the integral structure's characteristic strength is a recognition of time's complexity, a fluidity of experience, qualitative experience of time as a multivalent intensity, right? Time slows down and it speeds up. Time is reciprocity and relationality. Time is seeing oneself as a relational process, a being made of time, distributed across space and time, that's always in relationship with past and future. This kind of gives us a sense of integral time. And I think it also kind of points out, as we hear this description, I think for many folks, they kind of readily go like, oh, well, this definitely makes sense, right? And it makes sense in an ecological context. So I would say integral, even though Gebser was writing before the ecological movement, et cetera, was really kind of coming to its own, he was nevertheless kind of an ecological thinker in his thinking about time and seeing time as relational, as distributed, as intensive rather than extensive. I hope that all comes together a little bit.
Yeah, that's pretty good considering you could write a whole book about it yourself. So thanks for that. And just to almost bring the opposite in, because I know I've touched upon this with you before. So we're now using a global platform. We've got we've graced and blessed by somebody in Kenya joining the call. We've got people in Germany, and you and Tom are in America. So there's this element that globalizations has made us more connected. and more aware, like we're much more aware of suffering in Somalia or suffering in the Philippines or whatever than we ever would have been throughout history. So that seems to be a new sort of awareness. How would you say that kind of technical, you'd say, capacity mirrors or isn't connected to this planetary development you're talking about?
Yeah, great question. It's an inexhaustive question in that I think it's something we're never going to fully answer, and asking it's really important at the same time, right?
Yeah,
An adjacent thinker, Teilhard de Chardin, wrote quite a bit about this sort of noosphere, right? This sort of thinking layer of the earth. And he articulated, Gebser acknowledged Teilhard's writings and sort of saw him as a convergent thinker, uh, with some differences, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the noosphere has a cultural form, a cultural expression. Certainly, communication technologies are one way in which the world kind of envelops into this thinking layer. Um, Now, I think one of Gebser's distinctions about the aperspectival world and the kind of the process in which the mutations unfold as a very complex one is helpful here, because we can see different elements and layers, right? Technology and globalization are let's say characteristics that are Janus faced, in the sense that they are seeming to extend things like, let's say, capitalism or colonization, et cetera, to new scales and new intensities that are not what we would like to associate with the planetary, with an integral uh, future culture, right? But they have elements, nevertheless, of this kind of bringing together of the world. So they're ambiguous.
mm,
I think with all of the kind of projects of modernity, they're all kind of ambiguous advancements and expressions of the integral. They're kind of, as Gebser would say, quoting one of the Romantic poets, modernity is half-born, right? And in the sense that it's, there are elements of integrality and there's elements of a deficient mental, right? A perspectival capture and spatialization of the world, which of course can only lead to further atomization, alienation. So it's always both. It's always going to be both, especially when it comes to the conditions of our world. They're Janus faced. We live in an interim world, a world between worlds, as Gebser might say, and as I very much believe is true. Uh, Gloria Anzaldúa is a great feminist scholar, philosopher, who has this term nepantla, which means being between realities, being in a state of between. And I think this
right.
so wonderfully expresses what it means to be in our world right now, where we see so many promises of interconnectivity and a deeper sense of relation, a deeper sense of a planetary whole, and then also the sort of same old game and sort of
Yeah.
deficient, exhaustive mapping of the world, right? Which is not. This is why I think that distinction between globalization and planetization is so important. We need to really kind of understand what's what when we talk about these things.
I think that's a great way to language it because of the ambiguity of the developments of modernity. I mean, I think, this term solastalgia that's going around grief for the planet that, is not going to survive and that or may not survive or may never, ever be the same. So there's these achievements that we've got now through this call, but there's a shadow side to them. The ambiguity, I think, is a great way to express it. I'm wondering if you've got something that you're think might be suitable that's in your new book or that you've written recently that you'd love to read people, because I think there's something that you transmit in your writing that kind of brings Gebser or this uh, um, culture of integral like really to light and really out. And where whenever I hear it, I resonate deeply with your words. So have you got something handy to share with people, or
Yeah, well, I could.
it might need a little contextualizing, of course.
Right. Right. So the book I'm working on right now, it's called Fragments of an Integral Future. And it's very much an experiment, a creative experiment, and how, my first book was called Seeing Through the World, Gene Gebser and Integral Consciousness, and it was really a retelling of Gebser's thinking, an attempt to distill and make accessible Gebser's thinking, and then kind of provide some of my own commentary, some of my own context, and then try to kind of pivot his thinking, because he was writing in the mid-century of the last century to our own time. What are examples of aperspectivity and this new relationship with integral time? How is this showing up in culture? He was so good at pointing out, let's say, early 20th century movements and surrealism and Dada and et cetera, were like, oh, look, here's how the immaterial is breaking back into our reality. Here's how we're attempting to express the integrality of time by showing, trying to incorporate time into a painting, right? Or break a kind of systemic way of thinking in favor of improvisation in music. We see all of these radical experiments, creative experiments in the 20th century. My thinking is, well, certainly is happening today as well. So a large part of this book is looking at that today. How can we really bring Gebser and bring him into conversation with our present in a much more direct way? But also, part of my writing here is attempting to do this with our models and histories of consciousness, right? To really kind of get a sense of Gebser's integral time. I've been searching for metaphors and different images to play with. So the big chapter I'm working on, you probably have heard me ramble about this quite a bit, it's called Revisioning the History of Consciousness, or Revisions, Myths, and Narratives in the History of Consciousness. And the idea is to really kind of have a radical form of thinking as a practice, and then also as a reclamation of time. If we can reclaim our history, if we can take the narratives that we've sort of taken for granted about progress and teleology and retool them and rework them, our history can become a kind of emancipatory praxis, right, for imagining the future. So I could read a little bit of that if you want.
I'd love to hear that. I'm sure everybody else would. A passage just to punctuate this point about time, because I do think indigenous populations and indigenous wisdom did have a different relationship to time, not only cyclical, but a kind of much more intuitive relationship, because the world wasn't so separated into me, the other, and spirit and ancestors. That was a much more fluid perception. So be interesting if you're touching upon that, but we don't have to answer that as a question, but I just thought I'd throw it in. So I'm going to unpin myself and just let you read away, Jeremy.
Great. This one won't be too long, but it's probably chapter 3, unless a surprise chapter pops up, which is totally possible in the writing process. But so to give you some context, the opening chapters are an exploration of integral time, and I'm playing with metaphors, different ecological metaphors for thinking relationally and perceiving time relationally. And I've been using the rhizome as one of these fantastic images that really gives us this interrelated, relational, dynamic, back and forth image of time that sort of it has a body, right? There's a diachronic body to the rhizome, in that it puts its feelers out in multiple directions. It can, there's no real center to it. The center is everywhere and nowhere. There's a sense of wholeness and continuity, and there's a sense of difference, right? That same kind of theme here of differentiation, integration. Anyway, the rhizome is a wonderful image. And that's what I've been playing with. So I open it by saying, if transformations of consciousness involve the wild path of reversals and turnings, rhizomes and retrievals, then a revisioning of the history of consciousness with that mycelial shape in mind is a welcome move. What unique insights would such a re-envisioning demonstrate? What emergent forms of narrative might be ascertained if the history of consciousness unfoldment were told according to rhizome and root? We've already been thinking with the root, as it were, so a retelling is in order. Revision, from the French word revoir, again and seeing, putting those two elements together etymologically. Seeing again indicates a gesturing towards something that we may have missed upon first glance. It is the act of looking again. This essay asks the reader to participate in an exercise, a seeing history again through the imagination. It is also a response to the wealth of new anthropological and indigenous scholarship. I guess I did hit that point for you, Dave, accrued in recent years, which already have taken predominant Eurocentric tales of progress to task. Re-envisioning invites us to remind the past in search of other stories that reach different conclusions. There's nothing new under the sun, Octavia Butler wrote, but there are new suns. So too are there new histories. Look again. What if we were altogether not interested in progressive directive mythologies of time, but reveled in the sheer variegation of cultural complexity? What would an exercise in nonlinear history, which would not reject or fixate on linear or progressive movements, but simply recognize them in certain relative contexts, like the flows of a watershed, a root reaching for nutrients, or the patient and patterned flows of geological strata, tell us about the aforementioned big questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? And where am I going? What if we entered history like the rhizome? Could we still arrive at a big picture, scry the patterns of meaning in emergent macrohistorical stories? And finally, what could we learn about our shared planetary futures this way? We might, according to Gebser, engage in a mode of doing history, quote, divested of mere temporality and its sequential nature, not the history of dates, but of the dateless. An integral approach to history means something like thinking and visualizing history as an interactive and pliable body of past-future relations, complex loops, intersecting scales and rhythms. Altogether, it offers a new gestalt, an overall shape for a planetary temporix. In chapter 1, this book proposed that we can attend to the presence of myth in our history, and in that process of clearing out all of those unexamined linear narratives is precisely what opens the future rather than closes it down. To talk about the future, we begin with a new relationship with the past. The two are bound up in each other. We enter the future sideways, orthogonally, moving through strange reversals. We enter that cultural horizon of imagination and myth, especially those myths concerning our origins, where backleaps into tomorrow spring into the realm of possibility, where time is grasped beyond the comprehension of the waking mind, an unthinkable continuity of the dead, the living, and the unborn. Okay, that's the end of the little opening section.
Gorgeous. Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm just going to stop the recording.